I am Chloe, 32 years old, and my family spent my entire life convincing everyone I was a financial failure. I sat quietly at my younger sister's engagement dinner inside a private Manhattan dining room, listening to my parents mock my modest lifestyle. Then her billionaire fiancé leaned across the table, caught a glimpse of a secure federal notification on my phone, and murmured, "Wait, you are the director at Vanguard." The room went dead silent. My mother dropped her silver fork. Before I explain how I legally dismantled my family's fraudulent empire and left them homeless, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy seeing toxic relatives realize they picked a fight with the wrong woman. The air inside the Michelin-starred restaurant smelled of truffles and aged Bordeaux. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table wearing a simple tailored charcoal blazer. To the untrained eye, my outfit looked like standard office attire. Anyone who actually understood luxury fabrics would recognize the Italian silk blend. But my family only recognized loud designer logos. My mother, Cynthia, tapped her crystal champagne flute with a manicured fingernail. She directed her attention to my future brother-in-law, Marcus. Marcus was a 35-year-old African-American managing partner at a prominent Wall Street venture capital firm. He was sharp, observant, and radiated quiet authority. He sat next to my 29-year-old sister, Harper. Harper wore a custom sequined gown that caught the dim restaurant lighting, playing the role of a highly successful luxury real estate developer. "Marcus, we are just so incredibly proud of Harper," my father Thomas boasted. He leaned over his plate of roasted duck. "She built her real estate firm from nothing. It takes real vision to dominate the luxury housing market. Not everyone has that kind of drive." Thomas shifted his gaze toward me, offering a tight, pitying smile. "Take Chloe, for example. She is content pushing paper as a mid-level compliance clerk. It pays the rent, I suppose, but she lacks her sister's ambition." I did not defend myself. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Arguing with narcissists yields a very poor return on investment. I am the Senior Vice President of Compliance and Risk Management at one of the largest financial conglomerates in New York. I handle federal audits, dismantle corporate fraud, and secure billions in institutional assets. My family assumed I was a low-level desk worker because I refused to fund their extravagant vacations. My phone rested face up next to my water glass. A secure notification illuminated the screen. It was a direct encrypted message from the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding an upcoming market audit. I reached to turn the screen down, but Marcus had already seen it. His eyes locked onto the federal seal displayed on the alert. He paused, his wine glass hovering inches from his mouth. Marcus possessed the analytical mind of a venture capitalist. He processed the encryption protocol on my screen, connected it to the corporate name he had likely seen on my sister's guest list, and synthesized the data in real time. He lowered his glass and stared at me. "Chloe," Marcus said, his deep voice slicing through the polite dinner chatter. "Wait, are you the phantom auditor at Vanguard, the one who executed the hostile restructuring last quarter?" The string music playing softly in the background suddenly seemed very loud. Thomas stopped chewing. Cynthia's jaw went slack. Harper's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid panic. The idea that her plain, boring older sister held a position of supreme corporate authority threatened to shatter the illusion she had carefully crafted for her wealthy fiancé. Harper did not hesitate. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding any sense of familial loyalty. She let out a sharp, forced laugh and grabbed Marcus by the arm. "Oh, honey, no!" Harper chimed in, her voice pitched unnaturally high. "Chloe is not an executive. She is actually under a very serious internal investigation right now for mishandling client files. We try not to talk about it in public. It is terribly embarrassing for the family." I set my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. She had just weaponized a blatant lie to protect her fragile ego, trying to destroy my professional reputation in front of a major Wall Street player. Marcus looked at her, a flicker of cold calculation crossing his features, then looked back at me. He knew how to spot a desperate lie. I offered him a faint, unbothered smile, letting the silence stretch across the dining room. The trap had just been laid, and my sister had eagerly walked right into it. The dessert plates were quietly cleared away by the attentive restaurant staff, leaving behind a heavy, lingering tension hovering over the mahogany table. Marcus excused himself to speak with the valet regarding his vehicle, offering a polite nod to my parents before stepping away. The moment his broad shoulders disappeared around the corner, the artificial warmth in my family evaporated. Harper did not wait for the other patrons to look away. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist like a steel vise, her sharp acrylic nails digging fiercely into the fabric of my charcoal blazer. We need a private word right now, she hissed, dragging me forcefully toward the corridor. Cynthia followed closely behind her heels, clicking a rapid, aggressive rhythm against the imported marble tile. They pushed me into the opulent women's lounge located at the back of the establishment. Cynthia reached behind her and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, sealing us inside a quiet chamber of gold leaf mirrors and stark vanity lighting. Harper dropped the fragile, innocent bride routine entirely. Her face contorted, the heavy cosmetic contouring looking harsh and desperate under the bright bulbs. "You are going to ruin everything," she spat, stepping so close I could smell the sour tang of white wine on her breath. I calmly pulled my arm from her grasp, adjusting my sleeve where her nails had left red crescent marks against my skin. "I have done nothing but drink sparkling water and listen to you lie to a prominent venture capitalist," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Cynthia crossed her arms, stepping up to flank her golden child, forming a united front of familial hostility. "This is not about your little ego trip at the dinner table," my mother snapped. "This is about the Vanguard portfolio. Harper is securing a $10 million capital injection from Marcus tomorrow morning. The money is supposed to finance the Hudson Valley Luxury Development Project." I stared at them, letting the financial terminology register in my mind. Vanguard, my firm. Marcus operates a top-tier venture capital fund, and standard industry practice dictates that his firm uses Vanguard as a third-party risk assessment proxy before releasing eight-figure investments. The realization hit me with sudden, crystalline clarity. The Hudson Valley real estate project file had landed on my department's secure server 2 days ago. It was immediately flagged by our automated compliance algorithm for missing commercial building permits and highly opaque vendor histories. The file was currently sitting in my digital queue waiting for a final executive audit. "You need to log into your portal tonight and greenlight the risk assessment," Harper demanded, her voice tight with frantic energy. "Just rubber stamp the approval file. Marcus trusts the Vanguard algorithm implicitly. Once the compliance check clears, he signs the wire transfer. You are the final signature, Chloe. Push it through." I leaned back against the cold marble sink, studying the women standing in front of me. I looked at the $80,000 couture dress and the glaring diamond engagement ring that cost more than most citizens earn in a decade. She was not asking for a simple family favor to smooth over a social misunderstanding. She was demanding I facilitate investment fraud. "I cannot bypass a flagged compliance file," I explained, using the slow, deliberate cadence of a teacher addressing a stubborn, reckless child. "If a real estate project lacks commercial permits, releasing $10 million of investor capital is a severe federal crime. I would lose my executive license and face immediate prison time." Cynthia reached into her designer clutch. She did not retrieve a tissue or a tube of lipstick to fix her makeup. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and slapped it onto the marble counter right next to the brass soap dispenser. "You will push the file through," my mother stated, her tone devoid of any maternal warmth, "or your father will send this document directly to the Vanguard Board of Directors and the Federal Trade Commission." I picked up the paper, unfolding it under the harsh vanity lights. It was a printed bank ledger. The header displayed the Family Retirement Trust, a fund my parents had maintained for over 30 years. The transaction history showed systematic withdrawals over the past 6 months, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The destination account routing number listed on the document matched my personal offshore savings account. It was a forgery. It was a clumsy, amateurish fabrication likely created using basic editing software. The font kerning was inconsistent, and the routing codes displayed at the bottom were outdated by at least 5 years. However, in the high-stakes financial sector, a formal accusation of familial embezzlement, accompanied by even a fabricated ledger, triggers an automatic administrative suspension. The compliance division would instantly lock my credentials, seize my corporate hardware, and initiate a public internal investigation. My career would be frozen for months, my hard-earned reputation stained by the mere shadow of the allegation. They had carefully engineered this trap. They knew I valued my career above all else. I had clawed my way out of their toxic household, paid my own university tuition, and worked grueling 90-hour weeks to reach the executive suite. They assumed the threat of losing my empire would force me to submit. They viewed me as a disposable human shield designed to protect the fragile illusions Harper had built. I looked from the forged document back to my mother's icy glare. "You would destroy my career to fund a real estate project?" I asked, ensuring their intent was explicitly clear on the record. Cynthia did not flinch. "Family comes first, Chloe. Harper is on the verge of building a dynasty here. She needs this capital to secure her future. You have plenty of money stashed away. You can survive a little career setback, be a good sister for once in your miserable life, and do your job. The extortion hung heavy in the fragrant air of the restroom. They truly believed this was a simple domestic dispute. They thought they were leveraging guilt and fear to win a petty sibling rivalry. My mind raced past their hollow threats, analyzing the broader legal implications of the scenario unfolding before me. If Harper needed Marcus to wire $10 million so desperately that she was willing to commit blackmail against a corporate auditor, it meant her real estate firm was completely insolvent. She was drowning in undisclosed debt. This was not just a greedy sister begging for an unearned cash infusion. This was a coordinated conspiracy to defraud a Wall Street venture capital firm using a compromised internal executive. If I approved that file, the money would vanish. When the federal authorities eventually investigated the missing funds, my digital signature would be the only one sitting on the approval log. They were actively setting me up to be the sole scapegoat for a $10 million heist. I folded the forged ledger and slid it smoothly into the pocket of my charcoal blazer. The simmering rage inside my chest crystallized into pure calculating ice. Fighting them in this restroom would accomplish nothing. Screaming or pointing out the technical flaws in their forged document would only validate their perceived power. I needed them to feel victorious. I needed them to proceed with their fraudulent transaction so I could catch them in the act and sever their lifeline permanently. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the warm water wash over my hands. I took my time dispensing the soap and working it into a rich lather. Harper shifted her weight impatiently, the heavy sequins on her dress rustling aggressively against the marble counter. "Well," she snapped, her voice echoing sharply, "are you going to do it, or is Dad sending the email tonight?" I dried my hands with the plush linen towel and tossed it into the brass bin. I turned to face my sister and my mother, letting a soft, defeated sigh escape my lips. I dropped my shoulders, projecting an image of perfect broken submission. "I will log into the portal when I get home," I whispered, keeping my eyes cast downward. "I will clear the risk assessment flags and issue the final approval." Cynthia let out a sharp, triumphant breath. The harsh, judgmental lines of her face softened into a mocking semblance of maternal pride. She reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture that made my skin physically crawl. "That is my smart girl. I knew you would see reason. We are all going to be so wealthy, Chloe. Just play your part." Harper smirked, checking her reflection and adjusting her diamond ring in the mirror. "Do not mess this up. Marcus signs the wire transfer tomorrow at noon. The Vanguard approval notification needs to be in his inbox by 9 in the morning." I nodded silently, playing the role of the beaten child to perfection. Cynthia unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, pulling the door open. The ambient noise of the restaurant flooded back into the space, washing away the suffocating tension. They walked out first, their heads held high, strutting back toward the dining room to rejoin the men. They believed they had successfully blackmailed a senior executive into absolute compliance. They believed they held all the winning cards in their hands. I stayed behind for a brief moment, staring at my reflection in the gold leaf mirror. The timid, defeated sister they just saw was gone. The woman staring back at me was a relentless investigator preparing for war. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. I did not log into the corporate approval portal. Instead, I opened a secure, encrypted channel directly to my dedicated forensic audit team. The message I typed contained a specific directive: initiate deep background trace on Harper Real Estate Holdings. I locked the screen and slipped the device away. The extortion had given me the exact leverage I needed. The hunt had officially begun. The morning sun broke across the Manhattan skyline, casting harsh geometric shadows over the polished concrete floor of my corner office. I walked out of the private executive elevator on the 60th floor holding a black coffee. I did not shed a single tear over the blackmail threat my family delivered in that restaurant restroom. Crying is a biological response to feeling powerless. I was not powerless. I was the apex predator in a building full of sharks. I swiped my biometrics badge and the thick glass door of my suite glided open with a soft mechanical hum. My workspace was designed for one specific purpose. It was an impenetrable fortress of forensic analysis. I sat behind my walnut desk, placing my coffee next to my dual monitors. Harper thought her forged bank ledger gave her the ultimate leverage. She assumed I would panic and blindly approve her $10 million capital injection just to protect my corporate reputation. She severely misunderstood the nature of my profession. I do not hide from financial discrepancies. I hunt them down and I tear them apart. I booted up my workstation, initiating a secure tunnel into the encrypted corporate mainframe. The Hudson Valley Luxury Development Project was sitting right at the top of my digital queue. It was flagged with a bright red warning label by our automated compliance software. Marcus and his venture capital partners were relying on this exact file. They expected a standard risk assessment outlining basic market volatility and projected return on investment. I was about to give them a post-mortem on a massive financial crime. I bypassed the superficial executive summary Harper had provided. Fraudsters always make the front page look pristine. They hire expensive graphic designers to create beautiful charts and glossy three-dimensional renderings of buildings that will never exist. I ignored the colorful graphs and dropped directly into the raw data logs. I needed to see the actual foundation of my sister's so-called empire. I started with the basic logistics. If you are developing a sprawling luxury residential complex, you need permits, contractors, and raw materials. I pulled the federal tax identification numbers for the 3 primary construction firms listed on Harper's vendor manifest. I cross-referenced those numbers with the state licensing board database. The search results populated instantly. The screen glared back at me with a cold, undeniable truth. The first construction firm was registered to a vacant storefront in a dying strip mall. The second and third firms shared the exact same registered agent located at a post office box in Delaware. There were no heavy machinery rentals. There were no payroll records for construction crews. There was no concrete, no steel, and no architectural blueprints filed with the City Planning Commission. The Hudson Valley development did not exist. It was a phantom project built entirely out of thin air and arrogant lies. Harper was not a luxury real estate developer. She was the architect of a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. She had constructed a sprawling network of shell companies designed specifically to wash dirty money and project an illusion of extreme wealth. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracking the flow of capital through her corporate accounts. The ledgers showed incoming wire transfers from dozens of retail investors. These were small-scale buyers, people who had likely handed over their life savings hoping to secure early equity in a booming local real estate market. Harper took their earnest deposits and immediately routed the cash through her Delaware shell entities. She categorized the transfers as site preparation costs and architectural retainer fees to make the outflow look legitimate to any casual observer. But forensic accounting relies on finding the final destination. I ran a specialized tracing script to follow the exit nodes of those vendor payments. The money was not going to cement suppliers or urban planners. The funds were bleeding directly into high-end retail accounts and luxury dealerships. I watched the screen as the stolen investor deposits morphed into extravagant personal purchases right before my eyes. There was a $40,000 wire transfer to a premium auto broker, securing the lease on the imported sports car Harper loved to flaunt on her social media pages. She had labeled the transaction as a corporate fleet vehicle acquisition. There were recurring payments to a boutique in Paris, funding her massive collection of exotic leather handbags disguised on the ledger as executive marketing materials. She was using stolen money to maintain the fake persona of an elite socialite. The most sickening discovery appeared near the bottom of the expense report. A massive outgoing payment of $150,000 was routed to a premium event planning agency. She was using stolen capital from innocent retail investors to pay for the floral arrangements, the caviar, and the champagne for her upcoming wedding with Marcus. She was financing her bridal fantasy with blatant federal wire fraud. The sheer audacity of her operation was staggering. She felt entirely untouchable because she believed her polished exterior would prevent anyone from checking the math. But my professional instincts told me a crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. A fraud of this magnitude requires a powerful catalyst. To lure in those initial retail investors and to trick a Wall Street titan like Marcus into considering a $10 million injection, Harper needed to show proof of initial liquidity. She needed a massive chunk of seed money to establish the primary shell company and rent the glossy office space that made her look like a legitimate power player. The retail deposits came later. Where does a 29-year-old woman with a penchant for designer shoes suddenly acquire $500,000 in clean startup capital? I shifted my focus away from the outgoing vendor fraud and dug deep into the origination files. I isolated the very first deposit ever made into the Hudson Valley development account. It was a lump sum of $600,000 transferred exactly 14 months ago. The transaction was categorized as a primary foundational commercial loan. I accessed the county property records to find the collateral tied to that specific influx of cash. Commercial lenders do not hand over 6 figures without an ironclad guarantee. The digital deed loaded on my screen. It was not a commercial property. The collateral was a residential address located in a quiet, affluent suburb. It was the four-bedroom house I grew up in. The property belonged to my parents. I pulled the digitized loan origination documents, staring at the bottom of the final page. The electronic signature authorizing the massive equity extraction stared back at me in stark black ink. They belonged to Thomas and Cynthia. My parents had not just enabled my sister with blind affection. They had willingly mortgaged their entire existence to fund her criminal enterprise. They knew exactly what she was building. The extortion attempt in the restaurant restroom was not just about protecting Harper's ego. It was an act of desperate self-preservation. If the Vanguard funding fell through, the shell companies would collapse. The retail investors would demand their money back, and the bank would immediately foreclose on my parents' home. They were drowning in the very scam they had helped launch. But as I scrutinized the signature timestamps, a chilling anomaly caught my eye. The dates did not align with a standard home equity line of credit. The loan structure was overly complex, utilizing a fractured credit profile that made absolutely no logical sense for a couple nearing retirement. Furthermore, the debt-to-income ratio required to secure $600,000 far exceeded my father's modest salary as an insurance manager. The bank should have rejected the application instantly. I needed to see exactly how Thomas secured such a high-risk loan. I tapped the keyboard, diving into his employment credentials, bypassing the superficial credit checks. I accessed a secure database that tracked insurance underwriting and policyholder portfolios. As the data populated my secondary screen, the true, horrifying depth of their depravity was finally revealed. This was no longer just a reckless family mortgage. I was looking at a systemic financial violation that extended far beyond my sister's vanity project, setting the stage for a discovery much darker and far more destructive. The glow of my secondary monitor reflected softly against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my office. My father possessed a modest salary. He managed regional life insurance policies for a mid-tier firm, a respectable position that provided a comfortable suburban existence, but certainly not the kind of liquid wealth required to underwrite a luxury real estate empire. A man with his debt-to-income ratio securing $600,000 in commercial startup capital defied every metric of modern banking. I initiated a shadow credit sweep, bypassing the standard consumer bureaus and tapping directly into the institutional risk registry. I pulled his complete financial footprint. The screen populated with a labyrinth of secondary credit lines, high-yield personal loans, and aggressive bridge financing. The loans were not registered in his name. Thomas was merely listed as the processing broker. The primary borrowers on these crushing promissory notes were a list of 12 different individuals. I extracted the first name on the ledger, Evelyn Carmichael. I cross-referenced her identity using public demographic records. Evelyn was 84 years old. She resided in a continuing care facility in upstate New York. I pulled the second name, George Henderson, 81 years old, suffering from advanced cognitive decline. I ran the remaining 10 names through the database. Every single person attached to those massive liabilities was an elderly policyholder assigned to my father's insurance branch. Thomas had weaponized his administrative access. He harvested their social security numbers, stripped their pristine credit histories, and forged their digital signatures to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured personal loans. He targeted vulnerable seniors who rarely checked their credit scores, knowing they would remain oblivious to the fraudulent accounts until ruthless debt collectors started calling their nursing homes. I was bleeding the most defenseless members of society dry. Cynthia was not an innocent bystander in this financial slaughter. I traced the official stamps on the loan applications. My mother held a state notary license. She had officially authorized every single forged document, providing the legal authentication required to push the fraudulent loans through the automated banking portals. Their blind devotion to Harper had mutated into a coordinated criminal syndicate. They were systematically robbing senior citizens to finance the designer shoes, the imported vehicles, and the superficial luxury lifestyle of a 29-year-old narcissist. The extortion threat delivered in the restaurant restroom last night took on a terrifying new weight. If my parents sent that fabricated embezzlement ledger to the Vanguard Board of Directors, the ensuing internal investigation would scrutinize my recent portal activity. If I caved to their blackmail and rubber-stamped the approval for the $10 million venture capital injection, I would be authorizing a payout to a proven money laundering front. The federal authorities would eventually trace the origin of the shell companies back to the identity theft victims. My digital signature on the risk assessment would legally bind me to their operation. I would not just be considered a negligent executive who missed a few clerical errors. The Department of Justice would classify me as the inside collaborator who facilitated a federal racketeering conspiracy. They were not merely asking for a family favor. My parents and my sister were dragging me into a felony charge to save themselves. They intended to use my pristine corporate reputation as a human shield against their impending federal indictments. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the sheer depravity of their scheme settle over me. I felt no sorrow. The lingering traces of daughterly obligation evaporated, leaving behind a hardened core of pure strategic calculation. I reached for my coffee. Before I could take a sip, the sharp ringing of my secure desk console shattered the quiet isolation of my office. It was the direct external line, a channel strictly reserved for high-level institutional partners and executive directors. I glanced at the caller identification display. The incoming connection originated from the venture capital firm owned by Marcus. I pressed the flashing button, engaging the speakerphone. I expected the polished, articulate baritone of my sister's future husband requesting a status update on his pending investment. Instead, a much slicker, hurried voice echoed through the speaker. "Chloe, I am glad I caught you at your desk." The voice belonged to Gavin. He served as the vice president of acquisitions at the venture capital fund, acting as the primary lieutenant for Marcus. Gavin possessed a notorious reputation in the financial district for closing deals with reckless speed, prioritizing quick commissions over rigorous due diligence. "We have a hard deadline approaching on the Hudson Valley portfolio." Gavin continued, his tone lacking any standard professional courtesy. "I need that compliance authorization pushed to my inbox by 3 o'clock this afternoon." I remained perfectly still, letting his demand hang in the air. A vice president from an external firm does not dictate internal auditing schedules to a Vanguard senior executive. His tone carried a distinct presumptuous edge and unearned familiarity that immediately triggered my forensic instincts. "The standard risk assessment protocol requires a 48-hour review period." "Gavin," I replied, keeping my voice flat and unyielding. "The file entered my queue yesterday. My team is currently evaluating the vendor manifests and the municipal permit structures." Gavin let out a short, patronizing sigh. The audio distortion of the speakerphone could not mask the sudden nervous energy radiating from his end of the line. "Listen, Chloe, we both know this is a mere formality. The project is solid. Marcus is highly eager to finalize the capital transfer, and we do not want bureaucratic red tape slowing down a lucrative partnership, especially considering your unique personal connection to the developer." He placed a heavy, deliberate emphasis on the phrase personal connection. It was a thinly veiled tactic designed to blur the lines of corporate protocol. "I am sure you want to see your sister succeed just as much as we do." Gavin pressing his advantage. "It would be a real shame if Marcus started questioning your efficiency over a simple family project. If you stall this funding, the optics will look terrible for you at Vanguard. We expect the green light before the banks close today. Do not overthink it. Just clear the flags and send the approval." He ended the call before I could respond, leaving the dial tone humming in the quiet suite. I stared at the console, the pieces of a much darker puzzle sliding effortlessly into place. Gavin was operating far outside his lane. A legitimate vice president would never pressure a compliance officer to bypass critical red flags unless his own survival depended on the transaction clearing without scrutiny. Harper was running a fake real estate empire funded by stolen identities. Marcus was an incredibly shrewd investor who built a billion-dollar fortune by seeing through financial illusions. My sister could never fool a man like Marcus using a few glossy brochures and fake construction invoices. She needed a blind spot. She needed someone inside the venture capital firm to manipulate the preliminary financial models, intercept the background checks, and hide her lack of commercial permits before the file ever reached the desk of the managing partner. Gavin was not just rushing a lucrative deal. He was actively guarding a secret. My sister did not merely manipulate her parents into committing federal fraud. She had compromised the second-in-command at one of Wall Street's most formidable investment funds. Harper possessed an inside man. The sheer magnitude of their deception had just escalated from a domestic dispute into a multi-tiered corporate heist targeting institutional wealth. If Gavin was risking his lucrative career to bully a compliance director, he had a massive personal stake in the $10 million payout. I stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling grid of Manhattan traffic. They thought they had boxed me into an inescapable corner. They assumed I would fold under the combined pressure of familial blackmail and corporate intimidation. They had no idea I was about to lock the doors, sever their escape routes, and watch their entire fabricated kingdom burn to ash. I turned away from the panoramic glass window overlooking the bustling Manhattan streets. The threatening phone call from Gavin echoed in the quiet space of my executive suite. A vice president of acquisitions forcefully pressuring an independent risk management director to bypass standard compliance protocols indicated a severe breach of professional conduct. It meant he had personal skin in the game. They did not comprehend the vast surveillance architecture I commanded at Vanguard. Our firm employs a highly sophisticated insider threat monitoring network designed to prevent corporate espionage and unauthorized data extraction. It legally scans and retains the metadata of all external communications, interacting with our secure servers. I initiated a targeted sweep, bypassing the superficial text of the emails and focusing strictly on the digital footprints attached to the Hudson Valley portfolio submissions. I isolated every single data packet originating from Gavin and cross-referenced it with the incoming correspondence from my sister. The initial scan yielded standard business correspondence regarding zoning permits and equity projections. But forensic auditing relies on uncovering the negative space. I instructed the software to analyze the transmission timestamp server hop histories and geographical location pings. The pattern emerged on my dual monitors like a glowing beacon of deceit. Gavin and Harper were not merely exchanging financial spreadsheets during standard business hours. The data logs revealed a heavy volume of encrypted traffic occurring consistently between midnight and 300 in the morning. I traced the location pings embedded in the mobile file transfers. The geographic coordinates did not point to corporate offices or residential addresses. The signals bounced between a series of discrete luxury hotels located across Manhattan. The high-definition photographs clearly showed Harper and Gavin walking arm in arm through luxury lobbies, entering private elevators, and sharing intimate moments in secluded cocktail lounges. The timestamps on the photographs aligned perfectly with the late-night encrypted data transfers I had intercepted on the Vanguard servers. I observed Marcus carefully waiting for the inevitable emotional eruption. A lesser man would have slammed his fist against the table. A weaker man would have shouted, cursed, or thrown the folder across the room in a fit of broken-hearted rage. Marcus did none of those things. The billionaire venture capitalist simply went perfectly still. His breathing slowed. The muscles in his jaw tightened into rigid cords, mapping the sudden intense pressure clamping down on his nervous system. His dark eyes darkened further, transforming from analytical curiosity into a chilling, bottomless void. He was processing the ultimate betrayal, not just as a deceived partner, but as a chief executive officer who had been compromised from the inside. His trusted right-hand man and his future wife were actively conspiring to bleed his fund dry and humiliate him on a spectacular public stage. The silence in the subterranean cafe grew heavy enough to crack glass. Marcus carefully aligned the edges of the paperwork, closing the folder with slow, deliberate precision. He rested his hands on top of the manila envelope. When he finally looked up at me, the raw, lethal fury burning behind his stoic facade was terrifying to behold. He was an apex predator who had just discovered a trap in his own territory, and he was ready to hunt. "You did not bring this to the authorities," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying a dangerous, serrated edge. "You bypassed standard corporate protocol to bring this directly to me. Why? Because if I trigger an official compliance alert, your vice president will receive the automated notification," I explained calmly. "Gavin holds enough administrative clearance at your firm to scrub the offshore routing numbers and destroy the digital evidence before the federal agents secure a warrant. He will claim the shell companies were a clerical error. He will erase the Cayman Islands destination accounts, and you will be left legally bound to a fraudulent developer. I am not going to let them use my corporate signature to facilitate a heist against your fund." Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. The financial strategist re-emerged, calculating the exact parameters of the battlefield. "They need the wire transfer to clear on the morning of the wedding," he stated, piecing the timeline together. "They are using the ceremony as a psychological shield, assuming I will be too distracted by the event to monitor the settlement accounts. The moment the 10 million hits the initial ledger, Gavin executes the automated sweep to the Cayman accounts. They vanish before the reception dinner concludes. His assessment was flawless. He understood the mechanics of the theft perfectly. "What is your strategy?" Marcus asked, his tone stripped of all emotion and focused entirely on retribution. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness ground me. "I am proposing a honeypot," I replied. "A digital snare designed to catch them in the exact moment they attempt to move the capital." Marcus narrowed his eyes, processing the term. "You want me to authorize the funding. You want me to approve the 10 million wire transfer. I want you to proceed exactly as they expect," I confirmed. "You will stand at the altar. You will play the devoted groom. You will sign the authorization papers on the morning of the wedding, keeping Gavin oblivious to the fact that his cover is blown. But the capital will never reach the Cayman Islands. As the senior compliance director, I hold the authority to intercept and redirect flagged transactions within the clearinghouse gateway. I leaned closer, ensuring my voice remained a quiet, steady hum against the background noise of the library cafe. When Gavin attempts to trigger the automated sweep, I will dynamically alter the routing matrix. The money will not bounce through the cryptocurrency tumblers. It will flow directly into a secure escrow account, controlled exclusively by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We let them commit the federal crime on the record. We let them press the button that steals the money. And the second they do, we hand the federal government an airtight wire fraud indictment. Marcus stared at me, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. He recognized the ruthless beauty of the trap. We let them put on their wedding clothes and celebrate their victory, he murmured. And then we dropped the guillotine in front of every single guest. We finalized the details of our shadow alliance, synchronizing our timelines to ensure Gavin and Harper remained blind to their impending doom. Marcus agreed to maintain the facade, utilizing his immense willpower to endure the upcoming wedding rehearsals without betraying a single hint of his wrath. We stood up from the table, sealing our pact with a firm professional handshake. The foundation of their destruction was poured and setting nicely. I returned to my corporate tower, feeling a dark, victorious energy humming in my veins. The trap was armed and the predators were circling their own demise. But as I stepped out of the executive elevator and walked toward my office suite, my assistant intercepted me holding a thick legal envelope. Her face was pale, betraying a deep professional panic. "Miss Chloe," she stammered, handing me the heavy document. "A courier just dropped this off. It requires your immediate signature. Your parents are waiting inside your office right now, and they brought a corporate attorney with them. They say if you do not sign the asset collateral forms by 5 o'clock, they are seizing your properties." I stared at the closed glass door of my suite, feeling a sudden spike of adrenaline. The wedding was just 3 days away, and my toxic family had decided they could not wait for the venture capital injection. They were moving to strip my personal wealth using a legal ambush, and I had to walk into that room and fight a war I had not prepared for. I refused to entertain their corporate ambush at Vanguard. My security team escorted Thomas, Cynthia, and their rented attorney out of the lobby before they could even breach the executive elevators. I knew they would not accept defeat. Desperate individuals running out of stolen capital do not simply retreat. They change their venue and escalate their tactics. That evening, a cold rain slicked the streets of the Upper West Side as I returned to my private residence. My apartment was a minimalist sanctuary of polished concrete and dark oak located on the 40th floor. It was a space bought and paid for by my own grueling audits and relentless climb up the corporate ladder. When the private elevator doors parted, I found my family waiting in the shadowed corridor. Cynthia had retained a copy of the emergency access fob I gave her years ago before I understood the true depth of her deceit. They pushed past me the moment I unlocked the heavy steel door invading my sanctuary without a shred of hesitation. Harper marched into the center of my living room, dropping a thick leather portfolio onto the glass coffee table. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing through the quiet space. She did not bother offering a greeting. She stated that the wedding vendors were demanding immediate clearance of their final invoices. Her phantom real estate empire had consumed the capital they stole from the elderly insurance clients, leaving her cash poor just 3 days before the ceremony. She needed a bridge loan to cover the lavish floral arrangements, the catering, and the luxury venue rentals. If the vendors walked out, Marcus would demand a financial audit of the wedding planners, and her entire illusion would crumble before she could get her hands on his venture capital fund. She needed collateral to secure a high-risk credit line, and my unencumbered luxury apartment was the perfect target. Thomas stood near the entryway, acting as the enforcer for this domestic shakedown. He pulled his smartphone from his coat pocket and held it up, allowing the screen to illuminate his face in the dim room. He informed me that the fabricated embezzlement ledger was loaded into a scheduled email draft. The recipients included the Vanguard Board of Directors and the Primary Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He tapped his finger against the screen, stating that one press of a button would obliterate my executive license and trigger a federal inquiry into my risk management department. He gave me a simple choice: sign the asset authorization relinquishing my apartment as collateral, or watch my entire corporate identity burn to the ground before midnight. I understood that surviving a predator requires playing the prey. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid, mimicking the physiological response of a cornered victim experiencing a panic attack. I looked at Cynthia, hoping to portray a desperate daughter pleading for maternal intervention. I asked her how she could allow them to steal my home and leverage the only security I had built for myself. My mother simply adjusted her silk scarf and replied that family requires sacrifice. She told me I had hoarded my wealth for too long and it was time to support my sister as she ascended into the billionaire class. They fed on my manufactured despair. The sight of the formidable Vanguard executive trembling in her own living room acted as an intoxicating narcotic for their fragile egos. Harper pulled a silver pen from her clutch and thrust it toward my chest. I reached out, letting my fingers shake just enough to make the performance convincing. I took the pen and leaned over the glass coffee table. The document was a standard collateral assignment contract. By signing it, I would legally authorize a predatory lending institution to place a lien against my property, providing Harper with the liquid cash she needed to keep her wedding charade alive. My family believed my fear of losing my career had broken my spirit. They lacked the sophisticated training to recognize what I was actually executing on that piece of paper. Years ago, during a joint financial task force initiative with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I underwent specialized training in document forensics and psychological coercion protocols. I learned the mechanics of the duress signature. It is a highly calculated technique used by undercover operatives and executives forced to sign binding contracts under direct physical or psychological threat. I pressed the silver pen against the heavy paper. I deliberately altered the fundamental biometric pressure points of my handwriting. I changed the resting angle of the initial letter of my first name, shifting it 15 degrees off its normal axis. I disconnected the fluid cursive loops that define my standard corporate authorization signature. To the untrained eyes of my parents and my sister, the ink looked like the shaky, chaotic scrawl of a terrified woman resigning herself to defeat. To a certified forensic document examiner evaluating the contract under a microscope, it would serve as irrefutable proof of coercion. I was not signing away my home. I was drafting the physical evidence required for their impending federal indictment. I stood up slowly, dropping the pen onto the paperwork. I handed the signed contract back to Harper, keeping my gaze lowered to the floor. Harper snatched the document, inspecting the ink with a triumphant scoff. She carefully placed it back into her leather portfolio, treating it like the key to her impending royal coronation. Thomas lowered his smartphone, offering a smug nod of approval. He told me I had finally made a smart business decision. He advised me to wear a nice subdued dress to the ceremony and stay out of the way, so I would not embarrass the family in front of the Wall Street elite. They turned their backs and walked out of my apartment, leaving me standing alone in the quiet shadows. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing the space once again. The moment the deadbolt engaged, my trembling ceased entirely. The fragile, terrified facade dissolved, leaving the cold, hardened core of a compliance director. I walked over to my dry bar and poured a single measure of scotch. I allowed a faint, bitter smile to touch my lips. They believed they had secured a bridge loan to fund their vanity project. In reality, they had just committed formal extortion. By using the threat of fabricated corporate sabotage to compel a property transfer across state lines, they had elevated their crimes from identity theft and bank fraud to felony racketeering. The paper they carried out of my home was a loaded weapon pointing directly at their own futures. I had just provided the prosecutors with the exact physical artifact needed to prove criminal intent and intimidation. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, savoring the quiet calm of my sanctuary. The pieces of the federal snare were locking into place with mathematical precision. My parents had just guaranteed their own prison sentences while handing me the leverage to protect my assets. But the quiet moment of satisfaction was fleeting. My secure desk phone illuminated, casting a sharp blue light across the room. It was an encrypted message notification from Marcus. I set my glass down and opened the text. The venture capitalist wasted no words. Marcus informed me that Gavin had just initiated an emergency revision to the disbursement protocols. Gavin was attempting to alter the routing digits for the $10 million transfer, demanding the funds be released 24 hours earlier than the agreed-upon wedding timeline. The rats had smelled smoke. Gavin was getting nervous about the mounting delays and the sheer volume of lies required to keep the Hudson Valley project afloat. He was preparing to drain the fund and execute the offshore transfer before Marcus even put on his tuxedo. The timeline had just collapsed. The psychological warfare planned for the wedding day was now accelerating rapidly. I had to intercept the digital heist and counter their panic before the morning sun broke across the city. The rehearsal dinner scheduled for the following evening was no longer just a social obligation. It was about to become an active battlefield where every smile concealed a blade and every toast masked a lethal financial strike. I locked my phone and walked toward my home server rack, preparing to rewrite the routing codes that would send my sister and her inside man straight into a concrete cell. The screen flared to life, casting a stark pale blue light across my face. I initiated a secure encrypted tunnel directly into the Vanguard mainframe. The interface loaded, displaying the live traffic hitting our compliance gateway. The $10 million venture capital transaction was sitting right at the top of the queue. Gavin was utilizing his executive credentials to force the capital through an automated clearinghouse window. He had attached a high-priority tag to the wire transfer, hoping to push it past the standard hold times. I opened the raw data packet, examining the digital architecture of his theft. The origination account belonged to the venture capital fund managed by Marcus. The destination was a complex sequence of offshore nodes designed to scramble the capital through multiple international jurisdictions before landing in a secluded Cayman Islands shell entity. It was a textbook money laundering protocol. I faced a critical tactical juncture. As the senior director of risk management, I possessed the unilateral authority to hit the reject button. A single keystroke would instantly terminate the transaction and freeze the funds safely inside the venture capital account. But rejecting the wire transfer would generate an immediate automated error code on Gavin's terminal. He would know instantly that a senior compliance officer was actively monitoring his illicit activity. Panic would consume him. He would alert Harper, and the two of them would scramble to destroy their digital footprints, shred the forged real estate permits, and flee the city before the morning sun broke. I would save the money, but I would lose the criminals. I needed them to commit the felony. The federal justice system requires concrete execution of a crime to secure an airtight indictment. I needed Gavin to press the final authorization button, and I needed the funds to leave his institution. But I could not allow $10 million to vanish into an untouchable offshore haven. I had to let the theft occur while simultaneously trapping the stolen capital in a cage of my own design. I engaged a deep-level administrative override, bypassing the superficial approval screen and dropping directly into the core routing matrix of the wire transfer. This level of access required a series of complex biometric and cryptographic authentications. My fingers flew across the compact keyboard, inputting the passcodes with surgical precision. The core routing code opened, revealing the exact string of numbers directing the money to the Cayman Islands. I highlighted the offshore destination sequence and pressed the delete key. The illegal routing digits vanished from the screen. In their place, I began typing a new series of numbers. It was a highly specific 9-digit routing sequence, followed by an unlisted account identifier. This specific financial destination did not belong to a retail bank or a commercial wealth management firm. It was a federal holding account managed exclusively by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. This account functioned as an official government escrow vault. It was specifically utilized by federal agents to quarantine illicit capital seized during major racketeering and organized fraud operations. Once funds entered this specific federal ledger, they were immediately frozen. Extracting money from this government vault required a formal court order, a mountain of verified legal documentation, and the direct signature of a federal judge. It was a financial black hole for white-collar criminals. I verified the new routing sequence, ensuring every digit was perfectly aligned. Gavin would be staring at his own terminal, waiting for the system to validate the transaction. He would be looking for the simple word indicating success. Desperate individuals executing high-stakes fraud rarely read the microscopic fine print of the final confirmation receipt. They are blinded by the adrenaline of the impending payout. I saved the altered routing matrix. The system hummed as the new data integrated into the core file. I hovered my finger over the final authorization command. I was about to turn my sister and her lover into federal suspects, caught in the act of transmitting stolen wealth directly to the United States government. I pressed the enter key. The progress bar appeared on my screen, a thin green line inching its way across the dark display. The Vanguard servers were communicating with the Federal Reserve Wire network, running the necessary authentication protocols on the new routing number. The tension in the quiet restroom was profound. I held my breath, watching the green line reach the 90% mark. It paused for a fraction of a second, validating the institutional identity of the receiving account. Then the screen flashed a bright, crisp notification: transaction successful. The funds cleared the gateway. $10 million had just been legally approved for transfer. The money left the venture capital fund, but it was not heading to a tropical tax haven. It was hurtling straight into the iron grip of the federal justice system. The crime of wire fraud was officially complete, and the perpetrators had just handed the irrefutable evidence directly to the prosecuting authorities. I closed the mini laptop and slipped it back into my leather clutch. I turned on the gold faucet and washed my hands under the cold running water. I looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror. My expression was tranquil, devoid of the immense predatory satisfaction coursing through my veins. I dried my hands, unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, and stepped back into the opulent corridor. The transition from executing a federal financial trap back to attending a lavish rehearsal dinner required seamless emotional compartmentalization. I walked back into the dining room. The string quartet was still playing a soft, elegant melody. The elite guests were still laughing, holding their crystal glasses and discussing meaningless social trivialities. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it. I approached my table and took my seat, silently smoothing the fabric of my charcoal dress. I let my eyes drift toward the center of the room, where the guests of honor were holding court. Harper was seated next to Gavin. Marcus was standing a few feet away, engaged in a polite conversation with a prominent real estate investor. Harper held her smartphone beneath the edge of the linen tablecloth, attempting to conceal the glowing screen from the surrounding guests. Her face was a portrait of unadulterated euphoria. The heavy cosmetic contouring could not hide the sheer greedy delight radiating from her eyes. She looked down at the device and then nudged Gavin with her elbow. Gavin glanced down at the screen she was holding. The rigid, anxious posture he had maintained all evening instantly dissolved. His shoulders dropped and a deeply arrogant, relieved smirk spread across his face. He reached out and briefly squeezed Harper's hand beneath the table, a silent celebration of their perceived triumph. I reached into my pocket and touched the screen of my own phone. The stealth monitoring application I had deployed earlier was actively intercepting the cellular traffic bouncing from Harper's device. I opened the secure log and viewed the incoming text message she had just sent to Gavin. The message consisted of 3 simple, triumphant words: "We are free." I lowered my phone and picked up my water glass. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully drained a billionaire investment fund and outsmarted the compliance protocols of a major financial institution. They were sitting in a room filled with influential people, drinking expensive champagne funded by stolen identities, feeling like the undisputed rulers of their universe. They had no idea they had just funded their own impending indictments. They did not realize that the $10 million they were celebrating was currently sitting in a federal evidence vault. The rehearsal dinner continued its glamorous charade. My parents continued to boast about their brilliant daughter. Harper continued to play the radiant, blushing bride. Tomorrow morning, they would put on their expensive designer clothes. They would walk into an opulent wedding venue filled with hundreds of guests, expecting to finalize their glorious getaway. I took a slow sip of my water, enjoying the quiet, beautiful calm before the storm. The stage was perfectly set for the most devastating ceremony this city had ever witnessed. The air inside the bridal suite at the Pierre Hotel was heavy with the suffocating scent of imported white lilies and aerosol hairspray. A team of hired stylists hovered around the center of the room, treating my sister like a fragile deity. Harper stood on a velvet pedestal, admiring her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She was draped in an $80,000 haute couture gown, featuring layers of hand-stitched Parisian lace and a trailing silk train. The garment was a masterpiece of bridal design, but knowing it was financed entirely by the stolen credit lines of vulnerable senior citizens stripped away any illusion of beauty. It looked exactly like a physical manifestation of wire fraud. Harper held her smartphone aloft, angling her chin to catch the optimal natural light pouring through the penthouse windows. She recorded a short video for her thousands of followers, offering a practiced, modest smile. She typed a caption praising the virtues of hard work, declaring that building a real estate empire from the ground up made this milestone even sweeter. The profound cognitive dissonance required to steal millions and publicly brand yourself a self-made visionary was staggering. She tapped the screen, sending her fabricated triumph into the digital void. She truly believed her manufactured reality was impenetrable. Cynthia detached herself from the group of fawning makeup artists and marched deliberately toward my quiet corner. She carried a garment bag draped over her arm, her heels sinking deep into the plush carpet. My mother wore an ostentatious champagne-colored dress designed to ensure she received her own significant share of the spotlight. She stopped in front of me, shoving the plastic garment bag directly into my chest. Her lips curled into a tight, condescending line. "Change into this immediately," Cynthia ordered, her tone sharp and dismissive. I unzipped the cheap plastic covering. Inside hung a generic, unflattering bridesmaid dress made of stiff, unyielding polyester. The color was a washed-out beige, guaranteed to drain my complexion and ensure I faded entirely into the background. "It is not exactly custom-tailored," Cynthia remarked, smoothing the front of her own expensive bodice. "But we cannot have you distracting from the main event. Harper is the queen today, Chloe. She earned this pedestal. You just need to stand quietly at the altar and try not to look too miserable. Your plain little office job might impress your cubicle mates, but today, you are in a realm of true wealth. Do not attempt to overshadow your sister." I did not argue. I did not point out the frayed stitching on the cheap fabric or the glaring hypocrisy of her statements. I accepted the garment with a serene, compliant nod. I retreated to the adjoining dressing room and slipped the stiff polyester over my shoulders. I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror. My family demanded a drab, obedient background character. I was more than willing to provide them with the perfect camouflage. A predator does not wear bright colors when staking out a hunting blind. I smoothed the cheap fabric, stepping back into the main suite. My mother offered a satisfied smirk, seeing me properly diminished. They felt incredibly powerful, reveling in their perceived hierarchy. They needed me to look small to validate their own inflated egos. I walked over to the corner of the room, keeping my hands neatly folded, letting them enjoy the final fleeting moments of their reign. While Harper continued her narcissistic performance, the atmosphere 10 floors below in the groom executive suite operated on an entirely different frequency. There was no chaotic chatter, no clinking champagne flutes, and no frantic photographers demanding candid smiles. The air was thick with the disciplined, chilling silence of a tactical staging ground. Marcus stood in front of a heavy mahogany mirror, buttoning his crisp white shirt. He possessed the towering, imposing presence of a man who routinely conquered financial markets. He did not look like an anxious groom preparing for his vows. He looked like an executioner preparing his instruments. Marcus reached for his black silk tie, looping it around his collar with precise, measured movements. Seated on the leather sofas behind him were three men wearing sharp, dark suits. To the outside observer, they were the loyal groomsmen entrusted with holding the wedding rings and giving supportive toasts. In reality, they were veteran special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. Marcus had leveraged his extensive network of high-level government contacts the moment we verified the stolen venture capital. The federal authorities did not hesitate to infiltrate a high-profile gathering when presented with an airtight $10 million money laundering indictment. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with sharp assessing eyes, checked the time on his tactical watch. He adjusted the hidden earpiece coiled beneath his collar and offered Marcus a slight confirming nod. "The perimeter is secure," the agent murmured, his voice barely a low hum in the quiet room. The Financial Crimes Unit verified the transaction intercept at 0300 hours. The capital is safely locked inside the federal escrow account. Your vice president is currently standing in the lobby boasting about his upcoming bonus, unaware he triggered the snare. Marcus tightened the knot of his tie, his dark eyes reflecting a cold, lethal resolve. "Let them enjoy the cocktail hour," Marcus replied, smoothing his lapels. "A thief is always most vulnerable right when they believe they have successfully escaped with the prize. We stick to the timeline. We let them walk down the aisle." The grandfather clock in the hotel lobby chimed, signaling the approaching hour. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. The final acts of this elaborate theater were falling into place. Back in the bridal suite, Harper picked up her cascading bouquet of rare white orchids. She took one last lingering look at her reflection, practicing her radiant bridal smile. She turned to Cynthia, her eyes shining with greedy anticipation. "It is time," Harper announced, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "Let us go secure the rest of my empire." I walked behind them, maintaining my required distance. We moved through the velvet-lined corridors toward the staging area just outside the main chapel doors. The muffled sound of a classical string quartet drifted through the heavy oak panels, indicating the high society guests were taking their seats. I watched my sister grip my father's arm. Thomas puffed out his chest, standing tall in his rented tuxedo, ready to walk his fraudulent creation down the aisle. He believed he was ushering his family into a permanent era of untouched generational wealth. He believed the stolen identities of his elderly insurance clients were safely buried in the past. The wedding planner raised her hand, signaling the musicians to shift their tempo. The heavy oak doors began to slowly swing inward, revealing a sea of expectant faces and the blinding flash of cameras. Harper stepped forward, her chin raised high, bathed in the golden light of the sanctuary. I followed silently in my cheap polyester dress, my heartbeat steady and calm. I looked at the $80,000 gown flowing across the pristine white runner. Harper thought she was walking toward a billionaire fortune. She did not realize the luxurious white silk trailing behind her was merely a temporary costume destined to become the most expensive prison uniform in the history of the federal justice system. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung inward, revealing a breathtaking sea of expectant faces. A string quartet situated near the vaulted stained glass windows struck the first resounding chords of a traditional processional march. The melody filled the sanctuary, providing an elegant symphony for an event built entirely on deceit. The air inside the hall felt thick, heavily perfumed, with thousands of imported white roses cascading from towering crystal vases lining the aisles. 500 guests, representing the highest echelon of New York high society, turned their heads in unison. Influential venture capitalists, banking executives, and prominent real estate tycoons sat shoulder to shoulder waiting to witness what they believed was the merger of two powerful dynasties. My father stepped onto the pristine white runner, holding his golden child by the arm. Thomas beamed, projecting the manufactured image of a proud patriarch who had constructed a lasting empire. He escorted Harper with measured, triumphant strides, his chest puffed under his rented tuxedo. Harper's gown trailed behind him, the heavy layers of hand-stitched Parisian lace brushing against the scattered rose petals on the floor. She smiled radiantly, offering practiced, subtle nods to the influential attendees lining the pews. She was soaking in the adoration, convinced she was marching toward a $10 million coronation. She believed the digital theft we intercepted mere hours ago had securely settled into an untouchable Cayman Islands vault. I stood near the altar, encased in my rigid beige polyester bridesmaid dress. I blended into the background perfectly, playing the invisible, subdued sister my family demanded. My gaze swept over the front row, catching Cynthia dabbing a lace handkerchief beneath her eyes. My mother was performing her sorrowful joy routine to perfection, ensuring the wealthy wives of Marcus's colleagues noticed her maternal devotion. She dabbed at dry eyes, pretending to be overwhelmed by the beauty of a moment, financed by the stolen identities of her elderly insurance clients. Just across the aisle, sitting in the prime seating reserved for the groom inner circle, sat Gavin. The treacherous vice president looked exceedingly comfortable. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, resting his arm casually on the carved wooden pew. He checked his luxury timepiece, offering Harper a microscopic conspiratorial smirk as she glided past his row. He thought his financial extraction was a flawless success. He thought his digital tracks were buried under layers of encrypted code. He sat there calculating the exact moment he would slip away to meet my sister in a non-extradition paradise, leaving his boss to deal with the impending federal fallout. Harper reached the end of the aisle. Thomas lifted her delicate veil, kissing her cheek before handing her over to the man he thought would fund their luxurious retirement. Marcus stepped forward. He moved with the fluid, deliberate grace of a seasoned predator circling a trap. He took Harper's hand. His grip was firm and unyielding, but devoid of any actual warmth. He led her up the short marble steps to face the minister, leaving Thomas to take his seat next to my weeping mother. Standing shoulder to shoulder behind Marcus were three imposing figures. The guests assumed these men were lifelong college fraternity brothers or loyal business partners, honoring a friendship. They maintained a rigid, disciplined posture, their eyes constantly scanning the room rather than focusing on the bridal couple. Their tailored jackets concealed the tactical equipment and federal badges required to dismantle a criminal enterprise. These were the veteran special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, standing silently in the shadows of the altar, waiting for the signal to drop the hammer. The minister, an older gentleman with a gentle, soothing cadence, began the traditional ceremony. He spoke eloquently about trust, honesty, and the sacred foundation of a lifelong partnership. The irony of his sermon was a palpable heavyweight in the room. Harper gazed up at Marcus, her eyes shining with fake devotion. She squeezed his hands, projecting the image of a vulnerable, smitten bride. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, eager to secure the legal binding that would cement her perceived victory and legitimize her stolen wealth. I watched the seconds tick by on the large, ornate clock mounted near the choir loft. The atmosphere in the chapel slowly began to shift. The quiet rustle of expensive silk and the muted coughs from the audience faded away. The air grew stagnant. The minister turned the pages of his leather-bound book, moving steadily toward the final vows. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of these two souls," the minister pronounced, his voice echoing clearly over the sound system. Marcus turned to face his bride, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The warm, attentive groom facade he had maintained for months melted away in a fraction of a second. The mask dissolved, exposing the cold, calculating intellect of a betrayed billionaire who was about to scorch the earth. The minister looked directly at the groom, reading the familiar, timeless script. "Do you, Marcus, take Harper to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" The silence that followed was profound. It stretched far beyond the acceptable societal pause. 1 second ticked by. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Harper's smile faltered slightly, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in a tiny expression of confusion. She tightened her grip on his fingers, silently prompting him to deliver his line. She waited for the two simple words that would finalize her illusion and secure her escape route. Marcus did not say, "I do." He released her hands, letting her fingers drop awkwardly to her sides. He reached inside the inner breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket. He moved with slow, agonizing precision. The 500 guests held their collective breath, expecting him to pull out a handwritten vow book or perhaps a sentimental piece of jewelry. Instead, Marcus withdrew a small, sleek black digital storage drive. He held the device up between his thumb and forefinger, positioning it right in front of Harper's face. The polished metal casing caught the glare of the chapel lighting, flashing like a warning beacon in the dim sanctuary. "I do not agree to marry a fraud," Marcus stated. His baritone voice did not need a microphone. It resonated through the grand hall, carrying the lethal impact of a detonating explosive. "But I do agree to hand over your money laundering evidence to the government." Harper stumbled backward, her stiletto heel catching on the heavy hem of her expensive gown. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords paralyzed. The radiant, triumphant smirk froze on her lips, transforming into a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She stared at the black drive, her mind short-circuiting as the reality of her exposed crimes shattered her carefully constructed reality. She realized in a blinding flash of horror that the man she tried to con had been hunting her the entire time. The elite congregation erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and hushed, frantic murmurs. The high society veneer of the ceremony disintegrated instantly. Influential venture capitalists, banking executives, and prominent politicians leaned forward, their eyes darting between the groom holding the digital evidence and the bride trembling on the altar. They realized they were not attending a prestigious social event. They were sitting in the epicenter of a major financial crime scene. Thomas slumped heavily against the wooden pew, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had been vacuumed from the sanctuary. Cynthia dropped her silk clutch, the expensive bag hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. Her hands flew to her face, her jaw dropping in horrified disbelief. They recognized the lethal finality in Marcus's tone. They knew the federal implications of his words. The fake real estate empire they had built on the backs of stolen identities was crumbling before their eyes. The psychological shockwave rippled past the altar, hitting the front row with devastating force. Gavin realized the trap had sprung. The confident vice president, who had spent the evening rubbing elbows with the elite, suddenly understood his offshore accounts were empty, and his digital footprint was captured. The black device Marcus held contained every forged invoice, every illicit email metadata log, and every unauthorized routing command Gavin had executed in the shadows. The $10 million was not sitting in the Cayman Islands. It was sitting in a federal evidence vault. Survival instinct overrode his paralyzed state. Gavin shot up from his seat, his sudden rapid movement knocking the heavy wooden chair backward into the row behind him. The loud clatter echoed sharply, cutting through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. He did not look at Harper. He abandoned his co-conspirator without a single shred of hesitation. He turned his body toward the side aisle, his eyes fixed desperately on the heavy brass handle of the auxiliary exit door. He dropped his charming facade and broke into a panicked, frantic sprint, attempting to flee the sinking ship he had helped build. Gavin moved with the desperate, frantic energy of a trapped predator, realizing the walls had closed in. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly against the scattered white rose petals coating the marble floor. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy brass handle of the side exit door located just past the choir loft. He believed his athletic build and sudden head start would allow him to bypass the stunned wedding guests. He thought he could reach the bustling Manhattan streets, blend into the afternoon traffic, and disappear before the billionaire groom finished his speech. He was profoundly mistaken. The men standing behind Marcus did not hesitate. They were not college fraternity brothers or loyal business associates waiting to offer a champagne toast. They were highly trained tactical operatives embedded directly into the wedding party. The moment Gavin broke his stance and bolted for the exit, two of the groomsmen abandoned their formal positions. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency that instantly shattered the elegant illusion of the ceremony. The first undercover agent closed the distance in 3 long, powerful strides, wrapping his arms securely around Gavin. The physical impact was loud and unforgiving, echoing through the vast vaulted ceilings of the cathedral. Gavin was lifted entirely off his feet, his forward momentum brought to a brutal halt. The agent slammed him hard against the polished marble floor. The breath left Gavin in a sharp, hacking gasp as his chest hit the cold stone. The second federal agent dropped his knee squarely between the rogue vice president's shoulder blades, pinning him to the ground with inescapable force. The elite crowd of 500 guests watched in breathless silence. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around Gavin's wrists severed any remaining doubt about the severity of the situation. He was not just a runaway guest having a panic attack. He was a federal suspect being detained in plain sight. He thrashed weakly against the floor, his custom tuxedo wrinkling and tearing under the weight of the arresting officers. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent instructed, his voice echoing clearly over the stunned whispers of the congregation. "I highly suggest you use it." The sight of the physical arrest finally broke the paralyzing shock holding my parents captive in the front row. The carefully curated facade of aristocratic grace they had spent decades perfecting dissolved into raw, unfiltered panic. Thomas and Cynthia leaped from their wooden pews. They did not rush to comfort their daughter, who was trembling silently on the altar. They charged directly toward Marcus. Their immense entitlement blinded them to the tactical danger of approaching a man flanked by federal law enforcement. They truly believed their perceived social status granted them immunity from the consequences playing out in front of them. Thomas pointed a shaking finger at the billionaire groom, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. "You arrogant piece of trash," Thomas roared, abandoning his polite country club diction for pure venomous rage. "You think your money gives you the right to slander my daughter? You think you can walk into our world and ruin our family legacy with your baseless accusations?" Cynthia joined the assault, clutching the fabric of her champagne-colored dress as she climbed the first marble step toward the altar. Her fear mutated into vicious bigotry. She hurled racist and classist insults targeting Marcus and his hard-earned success. "You are nothing but street trash playing dress-up in an expensive suit," Cynthia shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical fury. "You plotted this to steal her project. You are trying to frame her because you know you are beneath her. You will never belong in our circle." Marcus did not flinch. He did not step back or raise his voice to match their chaotic screaming. He stood at the center of the altar, projecting the immovable strength of a man who had faced down hostile corporate boards and ruthless competitors. He let their racist insults wash over him, recognizing their shouts as the desperate death rattle of a fraudulent empire. He looked down at my parents with an expression of profound clinical disgust. The federal agents shifted their stances, placing their hands near their holstered weapons, ready to intercept the frantic couple if they took one more step up the stairs. While all eyes were fixed on the volatile confrontation unfolding at the altar, I stepped back into the shadows near the side columns. For my entire life, my family had forced me into ill-fitting roles. They demanded I play the quiet failure, the invisible background character, the obedient scapegoat. Today, they had stuffed me into a cheap beige polyester bridesmaid gown to ensure I remained unnoticed and diminished while they celebrated their stolen wealth. That charade ended right now. I reached behind my neck and grasped the hidden zipper of the ugly beige dress. With one swift, deliberate motion, I pulled it down. The rigid synthetic fabric parted easily. I let the hideous garment fall away, pooling in a discarded heap on the pristine marble floor. I kicked it aside, stepping out of their oppressive camouflage. Underneath the cheap disguise, I wore my true armor. It was a razor-sharp, custom-tailored white suit woven from raw silk. The cut was immaculate, projecting pure, unfiltered executive authority. It was the exact suit I wore when terminating corrupt executives and dismantling fraudulent portfolios in the Vanguard boardrooms. The stark white fabric contrasted beautifully with the dark shadows of the cathedral architecture. I adjusted my lapels, feeling the cold, familiar weight of power settle back into my shoulders. The timid sister they sought to control was gone. The risk management director was ready to take the floor. I walked out of the shadows and stepped onto the pristine white aisle runner. My heels clicked against the stone, a steady rhythmic cadence that pierced through my mother's hysterical screaming. The wealthy guests seated in the pews turned their heads, tracking the sound. They saw a woman shedding a disguise to reveal a corporate titan. The influential venture capitalists and banking executives parted instinctively, sensing the massive shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. They recognized the undeniable posture of an apex predator entering the hunting ground. I bypassed the struggling Gavin and the federal agents, pinning him to the floor. I walked straight up the marble steps of the altar. The minister had backed away in terror, leaving his lapel microphone resting on the carved wooden pulpit. I picked up the microphone, ensuring the audio feed was live and properly amplified across the sanctuary speakers. My parents stopped screaming. They stared at me, their eyes widening in sheer disbelief as they took in my white suit and my unwavering composure. The narrative they had spun for years, the lie that I was a struggling, low-level clerk, shattered instantly. They realized I was not a supporting character in their tragic play. I was the author of their impending ruin. He is not slandering her, I stated, my voice resonating through the grand cathedral with chilling precision. He is not lying, and he is certainly not trying to steal a non-existent real estate project. I stood beside Marcus, presenting a united, impenetrable front. I looked down at my father, who was clutching the wooden railing, trying desperately to process my transformation. Thomas opened his mouth to issue a command, but his vocal cords failed him. The authority he usually wielded over me had evaporated completely. I am the one who handed him the encrypted drive, I announced, letting the words hang heavily over the silent crowd. I am the senior vice president of risk management at Vanguard, and I am the one who personally audited the entire rotting foundation of this family. The silence that followed my declaration was dense enough to crush bone. Harper let out a strangled, breathless gasp, backing away from me until her spine hit the ornate wooden altar. She stared at the sister she had mocked, realizing I was the architect of her destruction. The illusion of her success was dead. But verbal accusations were not enough to secure a federal conviction in front of a room full of skeptical investors. I needed to show them the math. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a wireless presentation remote, ready to turn the sacred wedding altar into the most devastating financial tribunal New York had ever witnessed. I pressed a single button on my presentation remote. High above the marble altar, the venue automated projection screen hummed to life, descending slowly over the ornate stained glass windows. The audio-visual technicians hired to display a sentimental montage of the couple romance had been quietly replaced by my own security personnel earlier that morning. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and the high-definition projector beamed a stark, glowing image across the 20-foot canvas. The guests shifted in their carved wooden pews, expecting a touching slideshow of vacation photos and childhood memories. Instead, they were greeted by a complex, highly detailed forensic accounting flowchart. The graphic was composed of sharp red arrows tracing illicit financial pathways between domestic holding accounts and offshore entities. The stark corporate aesthetic clashed beautifully with the opulent floral arrangements decorating the sanctuary. I kept the microphone close to my lips, letting my voice carry steady and clear over the silent crowd. "This is not a love story," I announced, my tone dropping to a clinical, unwavering register. "This is a map of a digital heist." I pointed the laser indicator toward the top of the screen, where a $10 million figure glowed brightly. That is the exact amount of venture capital Marcus authorized for the Hudson Valley Development Project, a project my sister claimed would redefine luxury real estate. I tapped the remote and the screen zoomed in on the vendor manifests, but the building permits are fabricated and the construction firms are registered to a vacant strip mall. There is no development. There is only a black hole. I clicked the remote again, advancing the slide to reveal the routing sequence Gavin had tried to execute. "And this is the wire transfer protocol your vice president initiated during the rehearsal dinner last night." I looked directly at the wealthy investors seated in the middle rows, ensuring they understood the gravity of the breach. He bypassed standard compliance checks to funnel the investment into a Cayman Island shell company. They planned to drain the fund and disappear before the reception dinner even started. The murmurs among the 500 attendees swelled into a tidal wave of outraged gasps. Influential board members, federal judges, and hedge fund managers pulled out their smartphones, snapping pictures of the projected evidence. The elite socialites who had praised Harper's vision moments ago now stared at her with unvarnished disgust. The facade of the brilliant young entrepreneur was stripped away, leaving a common thief standing exposed on the altar. I shifted my focus to the front row where my mother and father stood frozen. The healthy flush had drained from Thomas's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. Cynthia gripped the edge of the mahogany pew, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. They thought the exposure ended with Harper. They assumed they could still play the role of the deceived parents who had merely trusted their ambitious daughter too much. They expected to fade into the background and survive the scandal. I pressed the remote again. The offshore flowchart vanished. A new document illuminated the massive screen. It was a dense ledger listing 12 different names alongside dates of birth and predatory loan origination records. The crowd leaned forward, trying to process the sudden shift in data. A heist of that magnitude requires seed money, I explained, walking slowly down the marble altar steps to stand directly in front of my parents. It requires clean capital to rent the luxury office space, print the glossy brochures, and create the initial illusion of success. I gestured toward the names on the glowing canvas. These are not affluent investors. These are 12 elderly individuals currently residing in state-funded assisted living facilities. They are long-term vulnerable policyholders assigned to my father's insurance branch. Thomas let out a strangled, uneven breath, stumbling backward. He clutched his chest, his fingers digging into the starched fabric of his tuxedo shirt. He realized the digital trail had unraveled his entire life. The secret he thought he buried in encrypted corporate servers was now broadcast to the most powerful people in New York. My father harvested their social security numbers and drained their pristine credit histories to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest personal loans. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the cathedral. Default notices are already arriving at their nursing homes. My mother used her state notary license to forge the legal authentication. They robbed the most defenseless members of our society to finance designer shoes, imported sports cars, and this $80,000 wedding gown. The sanctuary erupted. The outrage was palpable, raw, and unfiltered. Prominent guests stood up from their seats, shaking their heads in sheer disbelief. Cynthia broke her paralyzed stance. Her survival instinct overrode any remaining dignity. She abandoned her husband and scrambled toward the center aisle, reaching out with trembling hands toward the affluent women she had spent years trying to impress. "Please," Cynthia pleaded, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You know us. We are good people. We sit on the charity boards with you. Chloe is lying. She manipulated those documents because she hates her sister. She has always been jealous of Harper." The society wives did not offer comfort. They recoiled, taking deliberate physical steps backward to avoid her touch. A prominent media mogul's wife pulled her designer clutch close to her chest, turning her head away in blatant revulsion. "Do not speak to me," another woman hissed, stepping out of Cynthia's path. "You are repulsive. They treated my mother like a walking contagion." The social standing she had worshipped, cultivated, and protected above her own children evaporated into thin air. She was an outcast trapped in a cathedral full of disgusted peers. On the altar, Harper finally snapped under the crushing weight of public exposure. The poised, elegant bride disintegrated into a frantic, cornered animal. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The heavy layers of hand-stitched Parisian lace pooled around her in a chaotic, ruined mess. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her flawless bridal makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks of mascara running toward her chin. She looked like a broken porcelain doll discarded on a grand stage. Harper looked up at Marcus, who stood motionless, watching her break down with the detached interest of a forensic auditor. She realized he offered no sanctuary. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, radiating zero mercy. She turned her wild, panicked eyes toward the front row. The survival instinct that had defined her entire life triggered a vicious, immediate response. She realized she was facing federal prison and she needed a human shield. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Thomas and Cynthia. "It was them." Harper shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. "I did not want to steal from those old people. Mom and Dad forced me to do it. They told me I needed to look rich to secure the venture capital. They said they would cut me off and kick me out if I did not follow their plan. They orchestrated the entire thing to pay off their own debts. I am just a victim." Cynthia stopped pleading with her former friends. She spun around to face her golden child, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The daughter she had elevated, prioritized, and shielded from every consequence had just offered her to the slaughter without a second thought. The ultimate betrayal sliced through the remaining threads of their familial bond. "She is lying." Thomas bellowed, his terror morphing into defensive rage. He pointed back at his daughter, entirely willing to sacrifice her to save his own skin. "It was her real estate firm. She signed the checks. We only helped her because she begged us." Thomas sank onto the wooden pew, gripping his hair, unable to process the total collapse of his family unit. The betrayal was a spectacular display of human greed tearing itself apart. Harper threw her parents under the bus, hoping the diversion would save her from the wrath of Marcus and the federal government. She sobbed, clutching the tool of her expensive dress, begging the venture capitalist to understand her manufactured victimhood. I watched the chaos unfold from the center aisle, maintaining my crisp, professional posture. I did not intervene to stop their vicious infighting. They were doing the work of the prosecution for them, openly confessing to conspiracy and fraud in front of hundreds of witnesses. The digital evidence burned brightly on the screen behind me, cementing their guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. But the social execution was merely the opening act. The real consequences were approaching fast. Faintly at first, then growing steadily louder, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the sanctuary. It was the sharp wailing blare of approaching sirens echoing down the Manhattan avenues. The noise multiplied, signaling a massive coordinated response. The authorities had arrived to collect their prize. The vicious crossfire tearing my family apart on the altar provided a pathetic display of human desperation. Thomas and Harper continued trading venomous accusations, ignoring the silent judgment of the 500 elite guests watching their implosion. They pointed fingers, shifting blame and sacrificing their own bloodlines to save their fragile egos. They fought like cornered animals in a sinking cage, oblivious to the rising water. Their frantic shrieking was abruptly swallowed by a sound far more imposing than any argument. It began as a faint wail, drifting through the thick stone walls of the cathedral. Within seconds, the noise multiplied, morphing into a deafening chorus of shrieking sirens echoing down the Manhattan avenues. The rhythmic, piercing alarms cut through the tension, slicing the heavy air inside the sanctuary. Flashing red and blue emergency lights pierced the high stained glass windows, painting the pristine white floral arrangements in frantic, alternating hues. The high society crowd froze. Influential venture capitalists and seasoned politicians turned their heads toward the rear of the cathedral, recognizing the unmistakable cadence of an approaching tactical fleet. Thomas stopped shouting mid-sentence. His jaw slackened, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the center aisle. Cynthia dropped her hands from her face, the color draining from her cheeks until her skin resembled old parchment. Harper remained on the marble floor, her breath hitching in her throat, as the reality of the sirens pierced her narcissistic delusion. They realized the digital evidence projected on the screen behind me was not merely a tool for social humiliation. It was a formal federal indictment, and the executioners had just arrived at the front steps. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary did not open politely. They were thrust inward with staggering force, hitting the stone walls with a deafening crack. The muted classical music playing faintly in the background was replaced by the harsh static of police radios and the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots. Dozens of armed officers poured into the cathedral, forming a rigid perimeter around the exit routes. The polished illusion of a billionaire wedding dissolved into an active crime scene. The tactical units wore dark windbreakers bearing the stark yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Moving in perfect synchronization right behind them were specialized agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They carried themselves with the cold, unwavering authority of hunters tracking white-collar prey. The wealthy guests packed into the wooden pews shrank back, pulling their designer coats tight against their chests. They parted like a fractured sea, granting the federal agents an unobstructed path down the white aisle runner. The elite crowd understood the unwritten rules of corporate survival. When the federal government breaches a room, you sever all ties with the targets immediately. The lead agent from the Internal Revenue Service marched directly toward the altar. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a thick stack of manila folders stamped with official judicial seals. He bypassed the terrified bridesmaids and ignored the murmuring crowd. His sharp, assessing gaze locked directly onto my father. Thomas attempted to summon the remnants of his patriarchal authority. He straightened his rented tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest to project the image of a respectable insurance manager. He raised a trembling hand, hoping to intercept the agent and negotiate a quiet, dignified exit. "Officer, there has been a terrible misunderstanding." Thomas stammered, his voice a weak, hollow rasp. "We are in the middle of a private family ceremony. We can clear up these clerical errors in my office on Monday morning. I have prominent lawyers who handle my accounts." The lead agent did not slow his stride. He stepped onto the altar, invading my father's personal space with intimidating proximity. He did not offer a polite handshake or a discreet warning. He shoved the top folder directly against Thomas's chest, forcing my father to grasp the paperwork to keep it from falling. "Thomas, you are under arrest," the agent stated, his voice echoing clearly across the hushed sanctuary. "The charges are aggravated identity theft and severe bank fraud. You systematically harvested the Social Security numbers of elderly policyholders under your corporate care to secure fraudulent high-interest loans. You forged federal documents and bypassed institutional security protocols." Cynthia let out a high-pitched shriek, attempting to scramble backward away from the impending reality of handcuffs. A female agent flanked her, immediately blocking her escape route. "Do not touch me," Cynthia hissed, swatting at the agent's hands. "I am a licensed state notary. I sit on charity boards with the mayor. You are ruining my daughter's wedding over a fabricated spreadsheet. Your state notary license was revoked 45 minutes ago," the female agent replied, her tone stripped of all sympathy. "You utilized your official seal to authenticate forged loan documents, tying you directly to a federal racketeering conspiracy. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The sharp metallic click of heavy steel ratcheting closed around their wrists sounded like a final gavel strike. My parents, the architects of my childhood misery, were physically restrained in front of the very socialites they had spent decades trying to impress. Thomas slumped forward, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of a guaranteed prison sentence. Cynthia wept, ruining her expensive makeup as the harsh metal bit into her wrists. Harper watched her parents fall, her mind scrambling to secure her own survival. She pulled herself up from the marble floor, her $80,000 haute couture gown heavy and restrictive. She turned her desperate, tear-stained face toward the federal agents, playing the role of the naive, manipulated child. "I did not know about the stolen identities," Harper pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I thought they took out legitimate second mortgages. I just wanted to build a real estate firm. I am a victim here. You cannot arrest a bride on her wedding day." A seasoned FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his tactical belt. He looked down at the ruined Parisian lace and the stolen diamond ring glittering on her finger. "The federal justice system does not recognize bridal immunity," the agent replied, securing her wrists with practiced efficiency. "Harper, you are under arrest for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You created phantom vendor accounts to mask illicit capital and attempted to route stolen venture funds through offshore tax havens. You are facing 2 decades in a federal penitentiary." Harper let out a feral, agonizing wail. The pristine white silk of her dress crushed against the cold stone floor as the agents pulled her arms behind her back. The illusion of the luxury real estate queen vanished, leaving behind a desperate criminal draped in stolen fabric. While my biological family faced their spectacular ruin, a different kind of execution was taking place near the front pews. Gavin, the rogue vice president, remained pinned to the ground by the undercover federal agents who had posed as groomsmen. He thrashed against the marble, fighting the heavy knee pressing into his spine. The panic consuming him was fueled by the sudden realization that his Cayman Islands escape route was permanently sealed. "Get off me!" Gavin roared, spitting blood onto the stone tiles. "I demand my phone. I want my legal counsel. You cannot hold me without charging me. I have high-priced corporate defense attorneys on retainer. I will sue this entire department for unlawful detention." Marcus stood a few feet away, watching the traitor writhe on the ground. The billionaire groom adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, projecting the lethal calm of a man who held every single advantage on the board. He walked slowly down the altar steps, his leather shoes clicking a steady rhythm against the stone. He stopped right next to Gavin, looking down at the disgraced executive with eyes as cold as a frozen harbor. Marcus signaled the agents. They pulled Gavin up from the floor, forcing him to his knees. Gavin glared at his former boss, breathing heavily, his custom tuxedo torn at the shoulder seam. "You think you are so smart, Marcus?" Gavin sneered, a desperate, defiant edge clinging to his voice. "I know the corporate loopholes. My lawyers will tie this up in discovery for years. You will never see that money again, and I will walk away clean. I have millions hidden in offshore trust accounts you cannot touch. Marcus let out a low, humorless chuckle. It was a sound that sent a visible shiver down Gavin's spine. Do not bother looking for a lawyer, Gavin, Marcus said, his deep voice slicing through the remaining tension in the sanctuary. You cannot afford one. Gavin frowned, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? My domestic accounts have millions in liquid capital. Your domestic accounts had millions in liquid capital, Marcus corrected, kneeling down so his face was level with his betrayer. You severely underestimated the woman standing on this altar, and you entirely misjudged the reach of my venture fund. When Chloe presented me with the digital footprint of your embezzlement 3 days ago, I did not just call the authorities. I initiated a shadow audit on your personal financial portfolio. Marcus leaned closer, ensuring every word landed with devastating impact. I discovered your hidden gambling debts. I found the massive leverage margins you took out against dummy corporations to fund your lavish lifestyle. You owed millions to underground creditors who do not accept delayed payments. Gavin swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his bruised cheek. How do you know about the margins? Because I bought them, Marcus stated, a dark predatory satisfaction flashing across his face. I utilized a shell debt collection agency to purchase every single outstanding liability you possess. I bought your credit card debt. I bought your predatory loans. I bought the mortgage on your luxury condo. I am your sole undisputed primary creditor. Gavin's breath hitched. The reality of the financial snare began to crystallize in his mind, but Marcus delivered the final fatal strike before Gavin could even process the danger. The exact minute you attempted to steal my $10 million by overriding the Vanguard compliance gateway, you triggered a default clause in those loans. Marcus explained, his tone merciless. My debt collection agency filed an emergency asset seizure warrant this morning. We executed an instantaneous bank levy. Your domestic accounts are frozen. Your investment portfolios are liquidated to satisfy your outstanding balance. Your luxury condo is currently in foreclosure. Gavin stared at his former boss, his eyes wide and unblinking. His chest rose and fell in erratic, panicked jerks. He realized the trap was not just a criminal indictment, it was absolute financial eradication. You do not have millions hidden in offshore accounts, Marcus whispered, delivering the ultimate checkmate. You do not have a single penny left to your name. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot post bail. You are going to face a federal prosecutor with a public defender and a bank balance of absolute zero. The remaining color drained entirely from Gavin's face. His jaw went slack, his eyes losing focus as the catastrophic reality crushed his cognitive processing. He slumped forward against the grip of the federal agents, the fight completely leaving his body. The arrogant vice president was dead, leaving a hollow, destitute shell waiting for a prison transport. I stood on the altar, observing the finality of their destruction. The sanctuary was filled with the flashing lights of police cruisers parked outside and the quiet, stunned whispers of the New York elite. My father, my mother, my sister, and the corporate trader were all bound in steel chains, stripped of their wealth and facing decades behind bars. The operation was flawless. The digital traps had executed perfectly. Yet as the officers prepared to march my mother toward the heavy oak doors, she twisted her body around. She locked her terrified, tear-stained eyes onto me, searching for one last desperate avenue of manipulation. She was preparing to use her final breath as a free woman to invoke the deepest, most toxic strings of familial obligation. I held my ground, knowing the ultimate confrontation was imminent. The cathedral stone floor reflected the flashing red and blue lights pulsing from the street outside. Marcus stepped back, leaving Gavin a hollow shell on the marble tiles. The federal agents resumed their protocol, hauling the prisoners toward the exit. My mother dug her heels into the floor. The pristine champagne-colored silk of her dress strained against the movement as two agents guided her down the aisle. She saw the wealthy socialites turning their backs, whispering behind manicured hands. The societal exile hit her harder than the steel cuffs biting into her wrists. She planted her feet, twisting her torso with a sudden, frantic surge of adrenaline. The movement caught the agent off guard for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Cynthia to drop to her knees. She lunged forward, her constrained hands stretching outward until her fingers grazed the hem of my white trousers. Chloe, please, my mother wailed, her voice a shrill, grating sound that shattered the remaining quiet of the sanctuary. The tears ruining her foundation were no longer a calculated performance. They were born of genuine, suffocating panic. You have to help us. You are a senior executive at Vanguard. You have capital. You have institutional connections. Post our bail. Call your legal team and stop the bank from seizing the house. We are losing everything today. We are your blood. I gave birth to you. You cannot just stand there and watch your family be destroyed. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the cold stone. I did not step back. I did not flinch away from her grasp. I simply stared at her tear-streaked face, noting the stark contrast between her current posture and the arrogant matriarch who had cornered me in a restaurant restroom just days prior. She was trying to weaponize biology using the sacred concept of motherhood as a transactional bargaining chip to purchase her freedom. The elite crowd in the pews held their breath, watching the powerful corporate director look down at the disgraced woman on the floor. The federal agent stepped forward, reaching down to pull Cynthia back to her feet. I raised a single hand, signaling the officer to pause. The agent held his position, respecting the silent authority radiating from my stance. I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored white blazer. My fingers brushed against a thick, folded piece of paper. I slowly withdrew the document, holding it up so the harsh cathedral lighting illuminated the black ink. Cynthia squinted, her breath hitching as she recognized the legal header. It was the collateral assignment contract, the exact same document Harper and Thomas had brought to my luxury apartment to extort me. They had demanded I leverage my own home to float their collapsing real estate illusion. "Did you forget our last private conversation?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level, devoid of any rising inflection. "You stood in my living room and told me I was a failure. You demanded I sacrifice my financial security to elevate my sister into a fabricated elite class. You told me to sign this paper, or you would send a forged embezzlement ledger to the Vanguard Board of Directors." Cynthia swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the document and my face. "But you signed it," she stammered, clinging to a microscopic sliver of hope. "You gave us the collateral. We can use that to negotiate with the creditors. We can offer the equity to the federal prosecutors to lessen the sentencing guidelines. Just tell them the asset transfer is legitimate." I let a faint, razor-thin smile touch my lips. I lowered the document until it was inches from her face. "Look closer at the ink, Mother. Look at the angle of the first letter. Notice how the cursive loop is disconnected." The confusion on her face deepened. "I attended a specialized forensic document seminar hosted by the FBI 5 years ago. I explained delivering the facts with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. They train executives how to handle extortion. When a victim is forced to authorize a binding contract under severe psychological threat, they use a duress signature. It is a highly specific, deliberate alteration of their standard handwriting. It renders the entire legal instrument null and void in any court of law." Cynthia's jaw dropped. The fragile lifeline she thought she possessed snapped in half. "This piece of paper is not collateral." I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "It is physical evidence of felony extortion. You handed the prosecution the exact proof needed to demonstrate criminal intimidation. You walked into my sanctuary and handed me the weapon required to finalize your indictment. But the reality of your housing situation is far more severe than a voided contract I stated preparing to deliver the final strike. You think a commercial bank is knocking on your door to issue a standard foreclosure notice. You assume this is a simple matter of unpaid mortgage premiums resulting from a frozen bank account. You severely misunderstand the mechanics of the law you violated. When Thomas stole the identities of his elderly insurance clients to fund Harper's shell companies, he did not just keep the illicit cash isolated in a separate business ledger. He commingled those funds with your primary checking account. You used dirty money to pay the property taxes, the maintenance fees, and the utility bills on your suburban home. You integrated stolen capital into the very foundation of your real estate. The federal tax evasion investigator stepped up beside me, holding his own stack of warrants. Under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, any asset maintained or improved with laundered capital is subject to immediate government seizure. The investigator stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone. "We do not need to wait for a bank to foreclose. A federal judge signed the asset forfeiture order at 800 o'clock this morning. The title of your residence has already been transferred to the Department of Justice." I gripped the top of the collateral contract and pulled my hands apart in a swift, sharp motion. The heavy paper tore cleanly down the center. The crisp, tearing sound resonated through the silent sanctuary, a visceral audio cue marking the end of her reign. I placed the torn halves together and tore them again, reducing her extortion plot into useless, jagged confetti. I let the shredded paper flutter down, landing directly on the white rose petals near Cynthia's knees. "The bank is not taking your house," I told her, watching the final spark of defiance die in her eyes. "Your home is now federal property. The agents have already changed the locks and seized the vehicles in the driveway. You have zero equity, zero leverage, and zero sanctuary. You are officially homeless. Cynthia did not scream. She did not hurl another insult. The total eradication of her wealth, her social standing, and her physical home stripped the last ounce of fight from her body. Her shoulders slumped forward and she stared blankly at the shredded paper on the floor. The federal agents did not wait for another response. They hauled my mother off the marble floor. Cynthia's legs gave out, forcing the officers to support her entire body weight as they dragged her down the aisle. Thomas walked ahead of her, his head bowed, his spirit broken. The man who had boasted about his vast empire just an hour ago now shuffled toward the exit in a state of catatonic shock. Harper followed her ruined designer gown, collecting dust and dirt as it dragged behind her on the stone tiles. The intricate lace snagged on the wooden pews, tearing away piece by piece. Gavin marched in silence, his arrogant posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of a defeated fraudster facing decades of confinement. I stood on the altar next to Marcus, watching the procession of criminals exit the cathedral. The influential guests remained seated, offering no words of comfort or farewell. They merely watched the spectacle, processing the sheer magnitude of the downfall. The four figures reached the vestibule, stepping out into the brisk afternoon air. The heavy metal doors of the awaiting police cruisers swung open. One by one, my family members and the rogue vice president were pushed into the back seats of the vehicles. The heavy doors slammed shut, a series of sharp metallic thuds that echoed through the plaza like closing vault doors. The engines roared to life and the convoy sped away, carrying the architects of my childhood misery into the cold, unforgiving shadows of the justice system. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound, pristine quiet. The cathedral grew still, the toxic noise permanently silenced. The oppressive weight I had carried since childhood lifted from my shoulders, replaced by an intoxicating rush of absolute freedom. I turned to face Marcus, ready to formalize the true strategic alliance we had mapped out in the dark. 6 months is a standard fiscal cycle in the corporate financial sector. It is also the exact amount of time required for the federal justice system to process indictments, secure convictions, and lock the heavy steel doors of a maximum security penitentiary. The morning sun cast a brilliant glare across the polished mahogany table inside the primary glass boardroom on the 60th floor of the Vanguard Tower. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling arteries of Manhattan. The suffocating noise of my past had been eradicated. In its place resided a pristine, empowering silence. My secure desktop console displayed a blinking notification indicating 3 unread voicemails from the Federal Correctional Facility located upstate. I did not reach for the receiver. I did not press play to listen to the frantic weeping pleas of a mother adjusting to a concrete cell or a sister realizing her designer wardrobe had been permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. They were currently serving 15 years of mandatory minimum sentencing for their coordinated wire fraud and identity theft enterprise. Thomas had attempted to negotiate a plea deal by offering to testify against his own wife, but federal prosecutors do not bargain with the architects of racketeering conspiracies. They were ghosts locked away in a system that does not care about country club memberships or fabricated social standing. I highlighted the unread voicemail notifications and dragged them directly into the digital trash bin, pressing the delete command with a swift single keystroke. The digital erasure was the final act of sanitation. I was no longer a scapegoat. I was a sovereign entity operating at the apex of my industry. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom glided open, interrupting my quiet contemplation. Marcus strode into the room carrying the gravitational pull of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He did not wear the strained expression of a jilted groom recovering from a public betrayal. He wore a flawless, bespoke navy suit, projecting the lethal calm of a Wall Street titan who had just closed the most lucrative deal of his entire career. He walked toward the head of the conference table, tossing a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the polished wood. The gold-embossed lettering on the cover displayed the newly minted logo of our joint enterprise. We were no longer simply a risk management director and an external venture capitalist. We had forged a strategic alliance born in the fires of a thwarted heist. My compliance division at Vanguard had officially merged operational protocols with his investment fund. We created a proprietary financial ecosystem that utilized my aggressive forensic auditing algorithms to instantly verify the structural integrity of his capital injections. We built an impenetrable fortress that allowed his firm to dominate the market by acquiring distressed assets with zero legal liability. It was an unprecedented corporate merger that sent shockwaves through the financial district, elevating both of our portfolios into a new stratosphere of untouchable wealth. The federal clearance on the final acquisition just routed through the central gateway. Marcus announced, his deep voice resonating with dark satisfaction. The shell companies your sister created have been liquidated by the Asset Forfeiture Division. We absorbed the remaining clean commercial properties at a fraction of their market value during the government auction this morning. It seems their desperate attempt to steal $10 million only resulted in expanding our operational footprint. I turned away from the panoramic window and walked toward a sleek crystal decanter resting on a side console. I retrieved 2 glasses and poured a generous measure of vintage Bordeaux. The rich, dark liquid caught the morning light, highlighting the exquisite clarity of the wine. I handed a glass to Marcus, our fingers brushing briefly in a silent acknowledgement of the war we had fought and won together. We did not share the warm, emotional bond of a traditional family. We shared a forged, unbreakable allegiance based on mutual respect and shared survival. We understood the exact mechanics of loyalty. Marcus raised his glass, holding it steady in the quiet room. To the architects of our own reality, he proposed, his gaze locking onto mine with fierce, unwavering respect. I raised my glass, allowing the crystal to chime sharply against his. To the fortress, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the complex wine. Marcus walked over to the window, standing beside me as we observed the sprawling concrete canyons of the city. He took a sip from his glass, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Your father tried to send a letter to my legal department yesterday, Marcus noted, keeping his tone conversational. He requested a character reference for his upcoming appeals hearing. He claimed our shared history should count for something. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity of a convicted felon begging his intended victim for a lifeline was a fascinating psychological study. What did your legal team advise him? I asked, resting my hand on the cool glass. I instructed my general counsel to return the letter unopened. Marcus replied, a cold smile playing on his lips. I also filed a secondary civil suit to recover the legal fees we expended during the federal investigation. He will owe this firm a substantial sum the very minute he steps out of his cell in 15 years. The punishment must match the arrogance. I nodded in agreement, recognizing the tactical brilliance of securing a permanent financial lien against a man who had built his life on stolen identities. The taste of victory was flawless, untainted by any lingering shadows of guilt or obligation. I looked back down at the millions of people navigating the grid below. Society spends an incredible amount of energy conditioning individuals to believe that genetic markers dictate loyalty. They weave a dangerous narrative demanding that we endure psychological abuse, financial extortion, and chronic disrespect simply to maintain the fragile illusion of a unified family tree. They tell you to swallow your pride and sacrifice your own foundation to keep the people who share your last name comfortable. But blood is a biological accident. It does not mandate compliance, and it certainly does not excuse malicious betrayal. True power is recognizing the precise moment the people meant to protect you decide to view you as prey. When the very individuals who should celebrate your success attempt to push you down into the mud to elevate themselves, you face a critical defining choice. A weak person sits in the dirt and cries, mourning the family they wish they had. A survivor takes that exact same mud, lets it harden into stone, and uses it to build an impenetrable wall. You construct a barricade so high and so fiercely guarded that the architects of your pain can only watch your ascension from the cold isolation of a prison cell. I stood at the pinnacle of a financial empire, looking over a city I had conquered on my own terms. The fragile, frightened daughter my parents tried to manipulate was dead. In her place stood a titan forged in fire, holding the keys to a kingdom they would never be allowed to enter. I took a final sip of my wine, the rich flavor lingering on my palate. I turned my back on the window, ready to return to the boardroom table and orchestrate my next corporate acquisition. The past was buried, and the future belonged entirely to me. I set the empty crystal glass down on this mahogany table, the faint chime echoing in the quiet expanse of my office. Marcus gave my shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze before stepping out to finalize the integration protocols for our new joint venture. Alone in the penthouse, I let my gaze wander over the sprawling grid of Manhattan below. The countless people rushing through those concrete canyons were all fighting their own battles, many bound by the same invisible chains I had just shattered. Surviving the people who were supposed to protect you changes the fundamental architecture of your mind. You stop waiting for a rescue and become the engineer of your own salvation. Looking back at the wreckage of my parents' fraudulent scheme, three undeniable truths, standout principles forged directly in the fire of their deceit. First, society perpetuates a dangerous myth that sharing DNA guarantees loyalty. We are conditioned to endure chronic disrespect, financial exploitation, and emotional manipulation under the guise of familial duty. But blood is merely a biological coincidence. It is not a binding contract. True family is a strategic alliance built on unwavering mutual respect and shared survival. You do not owe your peace to anyone who views your existence as a disposable resource. Second, your greatest tactical advantage in any conflict is silence. When my mother and sister cornered me in that restaurant restroom and threatened to destroy my career, human instinct demanded a loud defensive argument. Instead, I chose quiet submission. I played the terrified, obedient daughter. Predators feed on panic and resistance. When you offer them a blank canvas of compliance, their inflated egos blind them to the trap you are setting right beneath their feet. Never interrupt an adversary who is busy signing their own digital confession. Third, the dirt they throw at you is the exact material required to build your fortress. My family attempted to use my hard-earned corporate reputation as a human shield for their racketeering syndicate. Rather than crumbling under the weight of their extortion, I weaponized it. I took the very forgery they used to threaten me and turned it into the cornerstone of a federal indictment. When toxic people try to bury you, do not weep over the darkness. Use the shovel they handed you to dig a foundation they can never breach. I am no longer the scapegoat they tried to manipulate. I am a titan standing at the peak of an untouchable financial ecosystem while they navigate the bleak reality of a federal penitentiary. Your power belongs to you alone. Protect it relentlessly. If you have ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives to safeguard your own future, or if you simply appreciate the cold, precise delivery of true karma, tell me your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Me Revenge for more tales of survival strategy and ultimate retribution. Never let anyone mistake your silence for weakness. Goodbye.